So here we are inside of Katana, and you can already see I have a pre-existing recipe. So I'm going to hit space on my node graph and it blows it up to full frame. Here we have 3 cubes that I'm going to use to illustrate and demo how subsurface works inside of Arnold and its standard surface. Then we have the import of our character that we're going to develop. And then we have a chrome ball, grey ball and Macbeth chart that we're going to use to aid us in our lighting and look development process. We also have a few pre-existing materials inside of the scene, so we don't have to apply everything in the length of this tutorial, giving us more time to focus on just the subsurface shader. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a camera for our character. So I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a camera create node. I'm going to view it inside of the parameters by hitting that green box on the right of the node and change the name to render_cam. I'm changing this to that because my render node later on is going to call upon that camera in all 3 of these different kind of scenes, if you will. So I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a merge node, and I'm going to merge the import with a camera create. So if you want to know how this works, the importomatic, you can import many kind of alembics. So you just hit the plus and then you literally just point it to the alembic that you want to import, and it's as simple as that. So I'm going to highlight all of them now and create a backdrop node. I'm going to call this backdrop node char_geo because that's what it contains. So in my other 2 backdrop nodes, my final merge is called scene_ and then the number. So I'm going to rename this merge node to scene_2 because that's what it's going to represent. It's going to represent our second scene. So we need a way to switch between these 3 backdrop nodes when we want to use them. So I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a variable switch node. This is a really cool node that will allow you to kind of switch between many scenes in one recipe. So yeah, it's a really good thing to get familiar with and use. So I'm going to plug each of the final merges into the variable switch, and I'm going to view this inside of the parameters. And in its pattern drop down, I'm going to type into each input scene_01, 02 and 03 that corresponds to the input of the variable switch. And I'm going to change the variable name to scene. Now I'm going to plug this in to the merge downstream to it, and I'm going to head on over to my project settings. So under the variables tab, I'm going to hit on this arrow down and go add variable. I'm going to hit on this spanner and hit rename and call it scene. I'm then going to type in scene_01 and hit enter. I'm then going to delete the number and hit enter again on 02 and hit enter again on 03. And now if we drop down, we can see all 3 of our scenes in our switch. So now if we view our variable switch, so inside of the scene graph under the eye, we can hit shift and click on the root, and that will allow us to view everything in the scene in our viewport. So now we're able to see everything. And the reason why we renamed that camera render_cam is because all of the other ones are called render_cam, and our render node later on is only going to point to that camera, so it's important that they all have the same naming convention. I'm just going to move the camera into a more appropriate position for what we're going to be doing. Here's a look at the cubes that we're going to be using later, but it's also kind of demoing how this switch works. I'm also going to rename this camera node just to char_cam. So viewing the variable switch, I'm now going to head on over to our character again. And after moving the camera, I can see that our kind of film gate is only square. So what we're going to do is we're going to head on downstream in our recipe, and we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a render settings node. I'm going to plug that in just before the render node that's already there, and we're going to hit on its parameters. So we're going to change this to 720p because that's the resolution that I'm going to be working with when I'm pre-visualizing some of this stuff and look developing it. I'm also going to change the camera name, so this is the camera that we're going to be rendering with, to render_cam, which is the name of all of our cameras inside of our different scenes. So now you can see that it's more in a 16:9 ratio, which is pretty cool. I'm just going to adjust it a little bit more so we can kind of get a nicer angle. And in all of these now, in every single scene, we're going to have the same aspect ratio, which is really cool, really neat. So I'm then going to hit tab on the keyboard and create an Arnold Global Settings node. So I'm going to hit on the green box, and inside of its parameters, we're going to go to texture systems, and we're going to make sure that texture_auto-generate.tx is enabled. And this is really important because it will trip you up, because your renders will be failing and you'll be wondering why. And it's because that tick box isn't enabled, because Arnold only accepts .tx files as its textures. And that needs to be enabled. I don't know why it's not enabled initially. It probably should be, but it's just something to look out for. If your renders are failing, that's probably why. And I'm just going to up the samples a bit so we get a little bit less noise in our render, because 3 is quite low. 6 is still quite low, but it's a little bit better than 3. So I'm then going to hit tab on the keyboard again and create a gaffer free node. This is the node that we're going to create our HDRI light in. So we're going to right click inside of the parameters here, and under add we're going to hit Arnold HDRI Sky Dome light. And in the materials we're going to click on the Arnold Standard Surface Image node, and we're going to point it to our HDRI image. So now you can see that our HDRI is in our viewport, but it's looking all kind of warped and wrong, because we've got our format set to angular when it should be set to lat long. I think that's a good thing to set it to, and I'm going to turn up the resolution to 6000 because you could see everything was pixelated. One thing to note is that inside of the file name, I have imported my EXR for my HDRI as a.tx. I've kind of converted it to that using Maya. There are many ways to do it. I think you can use scripts to do it as well. But I think Arnold prefers it. It can work with an EXR and it can with a TIFF, but I think it's less problematic to stick with what it knows. So using the keyboard shortcut Control \, I'm able to kick off a render, and as you can see, we just have a render of our character, but her skin is just like basically a Lambert. But that's not why we're rendering her. I wanted to be able to get the HDRI into the render, so it's not just on a black background, so she's kind of like looks like she is actually somewhere, and we can relate her environment to the lighting. So inside of the gaffer free, I'm going to go over to the contributions of the HDRI Sky Dome, and I'm going to turn the camera up to 1. And as you can see in the render, the HDRI is now behind her, and for me it's just easier to kind of develop something like that if I can actually see where she is. That's a personal preference, you don't have to do that, but it's so easy to turn on and off, so it's worth knowing about. So now we're going to step away from this character for the moment, and we're going to switch our scenes to scene 3, and we're going to take a little look at our chrome ball, our grey ball, and our Macbeth chart. So if I kick off a render of the chrome balls, we can see how they're coming out, and here you can kind of see that there's nothing crazy going on. The chrome ball looks a little bit dark, but the HDRI is slightly dark in its kind of negative spaces, like the curtains surrounding the kind of studio lighting. So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking there's not too much wrong with this HDR. There's nothing blowing out. There's nothing on the Macbeth chart that makes me think, all the values are wrong. So if I turn it up a little bit more, you see they get a little bit brighter, everything will get a little bit brighter. And if I were to turn that up, infinitely, it would all blow out and you'd get really crazy whites appearing. And that's when you start to worry about your scenes. So if you're working in a scene and you're wondering why things aren't looking right, it's always good practice to just drop a grey ball, a chrome ball, and a Macbeth chart in there, and just check on the values and check on how they look. And if they feel wrong, then there's something wrong with your scene, with your lighting, with your scale. So it's just a really good place to troubleshoot things. So right now I'm looking at them and I can see that they're not subdivided. So I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create an Arnold Object Settings node. And inside the parameters, I'm going to go to the Geometry tab, and I'm going to go to the subdivision surface, and I'm going to click on the drop down and pick Cat Clark. We're going to do 2 iterations, and now we're going to go to the cell drop down and add a path. So now we can go inside of our scene graph and select our geometry, and here they are. So we're just going to select the grey ball and the chrome ball, and we're going to middle mouse drag that into the path, and then hey presto, inside of the render they are now subdivided and smooth. So that's how you subdivide things inside of Katana using Arnold, which is useful because it's something that you will definitely have to do. So now, just as a stupid experiment, if I go back into the gap for free, and I go and I turn the intensity up to say like 100, you're just going to see all the values go completely white. I mean, this would obviously be a telltale sign that something is wrong in your scene, and you shouldn't be developing things with such, extreme lighting. You want the most balanced kind of thing you can get. Even if I go back in and I turn the intensity down and I turn the exposure up, again, everything will blow out. So there's loads of variables that can disrupt the kind of balance of your renders and your lights. So it's important to kind of maintain that, and I can't really stress that enough. In real life, you would probably have a set of chrome balls on set if you're doing live action or something like that, and we then use them in that situation to kind of match the lighting that was on the day of the shoot, to match the lighting on set. But right now we're just using them as a kind of gauge of how our HDRI is behaving and how intense our lights are. So now we're going to go to our variable switch, and we're going to go to scene 1, and this scene obviously has our cubes in, as we already know. And what we're going to use these cubes for is we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty of how subsurface works inside of Arnold. So I've already got a subsurface shader attached to them, as you can see. So I'm going to go over to my material stacks, and in the network material create node, I'm going to select the one with cube subsurface material network in it. With that selected, I'm going to hit Control and Enter, and that's going to allow me to go into where my materials are kept. So I'm going to delete the one that's currently there, and I'm going to create a fresh one. So I'm going to hit Tab on the keyboard and create an Arnold standard surface. So now if we kick off a render using Control and \, you can see that it's just completely white, which is just, the start of our journey on this subsurface venture. So I'm going to go to the subsurface scattering tab, and I'm just going to show you that when you turn the subsurface up to say 1, the diffuse that we've plugged in on our in the base section, in the base parameter, that's no longer driving our shader. So once the subsurface is set to 1, the diffuse and the base color, they don't count anymore. So that's something to pay attention to when working it. It kind of overwrites the base. So when you're making a subsurface shader, normally that's set to 1. So where you would normally plug your diffuse map in, you would plug that into your subsurface color. For now, I'm just going to leave it as like a beige. Now, the subsurface radius is something very different, and it kind of lets you control deep scatters, shallow scatters, and mid scatters using RG and B values. So for example, if I put this to 1 in the red channel, you can now see that because it's set to 1, it's a deep scatter the whole way through all of the cubes. And notice that with my subsurface scale set to 1, the smallest cube is completely engulfed by this kind of red kind of subsurface scattering. It's going the whole way through that because it scales with units. So this square, the smallest one, is 1 unit squared. The next biggest one, the middle one, is 4 units cubed, and the biggest one is 8 units cubed. So now if I put it to 0.1, what you're going to see in the smallest cube and in the biggest cube and in the middle one is you're going to see a much smaller scale. You know, on the smallest cube, I would say it's probably about 1/10 in. It's penetrating 1/10 in, and that's with the surface radius of the red set to 1. So, you know, this is something that's really worth kind of getting to grips with. You know, scale and subsurface is very important. So it's important to know how big your model is in comparison to how the subsurface works, so you know how to set these parameters accordingly. So now if we set the subsurface radius to green and just 1 in the green channel, obviously all the red will be swapped out for the green. That's a fairly obvious principle, but I just want to show you how this is working. So obviously if I set the radius to 1, it's just going to scatter very deeply through all of the cubes. And if I do the same thing for the blue, exactly the same thing is going to happen. So if I set the blue to 1, what you're going to see is, you know, the blue subsurface penetrating deeply. I'm just going to quickly change the index of refraction to 1.3 and the specular roughness to 0.6, so we have a better kind of way of describing skin. So I'm now going to change these values to something that could represent flesh or skin. So in the red channel, I'm going to set the value to 1. In the green channel, I'm going to set the value to 0.35. And in the blue channel, I'm going to set the value to 0.15. And now what you can see is our deep scatter is our red, and that's going the whole way into the core of our cubes. And then we have the green that's giving us this kind of yellow gradation between the red and the green. And then we have this white kind of rim around all of the cubes. So this white rim is where all 3 of the values are overlapping. So if I actually set all of these values to 1, what you would get is you would get a completely white scatter where all of the values are kind of, you know, scattering across each other and making a white color. So you need to think about it like a gradient, like a ramp, you know, and what kind of color do you want in the deepest part of your subsurface shader? And for us, it's red because it's flesh and it makes it feel alive, like there's blood there, you know. So, you know, this here is quite a good way of thinking about those 3 values as deep, mid, and shallow scatter. So now if we move to the subsurface anisotropy setting and we set it to a negative value, what we get is we get a back scattering effect. So the light will refract backwards towards the light source, and negative values are more common for things like marble, some wax maybe, it can look a bit more waxy. So when you're developing your surfaces, you need to consider these values. If you set it at 0, like we had it set the whole time, it will be an isotropic scattering. It will scatter evenly throughout the object, which is the most common style of scatter for most materials that will work. And skin, funnily enough, is actually a very forward scattering surface. So we're actually going to want to have a positive value. So I'm going to set it to 0.75. And now we can begin to kind of feel a little bit more like this is a fleshy type cube. So now I'm just going to turn the deep scatter on the surface radius down to 0.8. Just because 1 is quite strong. 8 is still quite strong. You could easily have it at 0.6 or 0.7, but we're going for quite a stylized look in our character, so we're going to probably leave the values quite high and effective. So, you know, kind of take a note of these settings and really get to know them. And we're basically going to apply a very similar shader with some color maps onto our character. So we're going to move away from the cubes, and now we're going to move on to our character that we want to look develop further. So now we're going to head on over to our second scene with our character in. And now what we need to do is we need to start to build a skin shader. So we need to create a material and we need to assign it to the correct geometry. So we're going to use something called a group stack node to do this. So here I've got a material assign stack here, and that is actually a group stack node that I've renamed. So I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a group stack just to show you how these work. So if we go inside the parameters, basically you have to drag any node into that box there in the parameters, and we're going to use a material assign to do that. So we're going to middle mouse shift drag it into there. So once the material assign stack is dropped into the group stack, you'll notice the node disappears because it actually goes inside of the group stack. And now if we hit the plus in the parameters, we can create as many as we like, so it's a really good way of containing your material assigns. But because we've already got one in our scene, we're just going to delete that and we're going to use the one we already have. So we're going to go over to the parameters of the existing node, and we're going to hit the plus to create our material assign. So with the new material assign selected, what we're going to do is we're going to rename it skin_assign. And it's good to kind of, name them accordingly as to what you're assigning, so you know what corresponds to what. And we're going to delete the spare one that we had in there because we don't need that. So we're then going to go over to our network material create nodes, and we're going to make a new network material create just for our skin shader. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and create a network material create node. And we're going to rename this to SSS_skin_char_network. So we're going to plug the network material create that we've renamed into the merge, and then we're going to rename the network material that's already in there skin_mtl. So then with the material create node selected, we're going to hit Control and Enter, and it's going to allow us to create our shaders. So we're going to hit tab on the keyboard inside of the node graph, and we're going to create a standard surface. I'm then going to plug that out into the Arnold surface of our skin material, and the next thing we're going to do is hit tab on the keyboard again and create an image node. This will allow us to read a file in, so we can read the texture maps in that we made in Mari previously. So inside of the parameters of the image node, we're going to read in our texture inside of the file section. So if we go over to the file section, we can point it to our textures. So this first one is just going to be our diffuse texture that we made in Mari. So we're just going to read that in. And there's one thing that you have to do in order to get your UDIMs to work, is you have to delete this part where it says, this is how many UDIMs there are. And in its place, we're going to type in a more than, less than bracket and just UDIM encased in them as the brackets. So, like so. And now this will point Arnold to all of our UDIMs that we'll be reading in. In this case, there's only 2. But that's very important to note, because otherwise your textures won't work. And that way of reading in UDIMs changes depending on what renderer you're using. So RenderMan will use a different one, 3Delight will use a different one, and Arnold will use a different one. It's all render specific. So it's useful to look that up. So we're just going to do the same for the subsurface color map that we made. So here we have our 2 image files. And now we're just going to make the node graph a little bit bigger so you can see it a bit more clearly. So I'm now going to just quickly plug in our diffuse map into our base color of our standard surface. And then I'm going to rename the standard surface skin_mtl_shader. So now with our material created and our material assign created, we're going to hit the back arrow in the node graph to go back to our main recipe, and we're going to go back to our material assign, and we're actually going to assign this material to our geometry. So now inside of the parameters of our material assign stack, we're going to select our skin assign. We're going to go over to our scene graph and middle mouse drag our skin material into the material assign section in our parameters. Then we're going to go to the add statements and add a path from our scene graph, and this is going to point to our character's skin geometry. So there, with it selected, you can right click and go add path from our scene graph. So you need to have it selected and it will automatically update in the assign. So now we can see that that we have a rather wooden looking and shiny doll looking stylized character that doesn't look like skin at all, because we've plugged our diffuse map into the base color and we haven't really developed it at all. So we can hit the forward arrow and we will go back to our subsurface scattering skin shader, or we can select that and hit Control and Enter again. There's two ways of doing it. And now we're going to actually make this look like the kind of subsurface stylized, kind of fleshy, soft, squishy feel that you would expect in a stylized character like this. So we're going to plug the output of our diffuse texture into the subsurface color, and inside of the parameters of our shader we're going to turn the specular roughness up to 0.6, and we're going to turn the index of refraction down to 0.3, similar to the cubes that we previously were working on. A lot of these are going to remain the same. So now we're going to go into the subsurface scattering section of our shader, and we're going to turn the subsurface up to 1. So now with this value turned to 1, our diffuse is no longer driving the shader, and it's now all in our subsurface color. So now, if you remember, we made a subsurface color map inside of Mari, which was a lot darker than our diffuse, which was more of our kind of skin pigmentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now plug that into our subsurface color, and what we get is we get a very dark looking shader. So I'm not going to totally use this as our subsurface color. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mix it with the diffuse color that we made in Mari as well. So we're going to have a blend of the two. So there's now a really good tool inside of Katana called material soloing. And if you click that little orb next to output and you hit 1, you can then view your textures and nodes inside of your shader individually. So you can solo them out, you can single them out. And this is really, really useful for making subtle adjustments or even seeing where we are. I suppose the best thing to compare it to would be how Mari's viewport works, where you can just view any node at any time with, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and so on. So what I'm going to do here is to blend these, I'm going to create a mix RGBA node. So we're going to plug the output of our diffuse texture into input 1, and we're going to plug the output of our subsurface scattering color into input 2. So now I'm going to plug the output of the mix RGBA into the subsurface color of our skin material shader. And now in our render, it's going to look slightly better than it did before, because it's a little bit more balanced and it's a bit more like what we had inside of Mari. But as I'm watching this render come in, I'm kind of looking at it and I'm thinking there's something wrong, because all of the subsurface is very white. And that's because we haven't controlled our subsurface radius. At the moment, all of our values are all set to 1. They're at default at 1. So we're getting that white subsurface scatter, which isn't what we want. We want kind of that fleshy feel. So we're going to go into our parameters of our shading node, and inside of our subsurface radius, we're going to change some of these, the balance between the deep scatter, the mid scatter, and the shallow scatter, to start to make this feel a bit more convincing. So inside of the subsurface radius, we're going to set the red value to 0.7. This is going to act as our deep scatter, our most penetrating color. Then we're going to set the green value to 0.15, which is quite low for a mid scatter, but this is going to act as our mid scatter. And we're going to set the shallow scatter of the blue to 0.1. And this will give us a good kind of starting point and a good base. We can always go back and adjust this and amend it depending on what character you're doing, but I think these settings will set us off on the right foot. And now if you look at our render come in, it's now starting to feel a little bit more convincing, like one of these stylized Disney-esque type characters. And the places that I'm looking at are the kind of nostril. I can see a little bit of light refracting through her nose there. And also on her ear, I can really feel that there's light passing through her. as we're not going for realism and we're going for like a very stylized aesthetic, I think this is beginning to work. She's beginning to feel squishy and soft and kind of like, you know, one of those characters that you would expect to see in like a Disney film or something like that. So now we're going to hit tab on the keyboard and we're going to create a color correct node. And what this is going to allow us to do, it's going to allow us to play with the color of some of our texture maps without going back into Mari and, you know, exporting them after we adjust it and going back and forth and back and forth. You know, I use a lot of remapping nodes to make these final adjustments in color at render time that kind of really help you finalize your renders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first I'm going to solo the color correct node because I want to see what I'm actually doing here. So I'm going to select the node, click on the soloing button and hit 1 to view it. So now we're viewing it, we can now see that this is actually quite dark, and before in the render, I don't know if you noticed, but I could see her nose was a little bit too red for me, it was too contrasty. So we're going to try and take some of that out and push some of that back a bit. So we're going to up the gamma to 1.2, and what this is going to do is it's going to knock some of the contrast out of the texture. Now we can maybe even knock, depending on what we think, we can knock some red into it or some yellow. So in the hue shift, if I set this to a minus 0.01, we're knocking a slight bit of red into our texture. And now if I turn this into a positive value, it becomes more yellow. So that's something to consider. You know, when you're working with skin tones, red and yellows are quite common things to knock into your skin tone. So I'm going to go on the red side. We're going to desaturate it a bit. And now we're going to solo the RGBA mix node just upstream to that one. So we're going to take a look at how it's mixing with our diffuse map. And I'm thinking this could potentially work. It looks a bit more kind of calmed down. Her nose looks a little bit less fierce to me. So now we can go ahead and view our final shader. You know, I found the material soloing to be really, really useful when kind of focusing on individual nodes and trying to make subtle tweaks to individual nodes inside of my shader. So it's a really quick way of really honing in and getting control over small kind of details and subtle shifts. So now I'm kind of looking at this render and I'm looking at my shader and I'm noticing that we haven't actually set the anisotropy. So as I was saying when we were rendering the cubes, we need a forward scattering value for our skin. I'm beginning to really like some of these details in this render, but it has a very even scatter at the moment and it kind of doesn't look totally correct. So to make it more physically accurate, we're going to set the anisotropy to 0.75 and see what then happens to our model. So now, because it's become a very front scattering effect and all the light is refracting in a different way now, we can see that the effect is, you know, instantly, without the render being done, we can see in the arms and we can see that it's being heightened throughout the whole bust. So we may need to make an adjustment to turn this down depending on how our render comes through. So we can just wait a second. So as this ear is coming through, we're now beginning to really get the impression that light is passing through that ear and we're getting that nice gradation on her earlobe that's quite nice, those kind of yellowy tones. I'm really liking what's going on there. But I can see on her right nostril it's kind of a little bit too fierce. And on these arms, you know, they almost look like they're glowing, like they're, you know, like they have some kind of glowing effect going on, you know. So I think we probably need to calm that down because although this is stylized, I think this is a little bit ridiculous and it's beginning to look a little bit strange, you know. So what we're going to do to combat this is we're going to go back into our shaders parameters and we're going to just turn the subsurface scale down, and this is going to kind of put a cap on how deep this subsurface effect is allowed to penetrate. So it should bring down the glow in the arms, the thicker parts, but you know, the ears and the nose should also be knocked back a little bit, but not too much, because it will still be affecting those areas in quite a substantial way because they're a lot thinner. And even on the hands and stuff, it will be knocked back a tiny bit. So, you know, we're going to wait for this render to come in and then see where we're at. We're getting closer and closer to a final render here, I think. Yeah, so like I am kind of happier with this. As this render's coming in, I think it's getting there. It's looking quite good. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to our main recipe and we're going to go into the Arnold global settings, and we're going to up the samples just a little bit, and we're going to change the resolution to 1080p so we can get a better look at any details that we may have missed, just to kind of quality control and check our renders, because right now it's only taking up a quarter of my screen, so I need to take a proper look at this render. So I'm going to up the samples to 16, and I'm going to up the lighting samples to 8. And then we're going to head on over to our render settings, and we're just going to hit the green there to look at that in our parameters, and we're just going to change it to HD. So we're going to do a 1080p render with slightly more samples. And when I kick this off, I'm going to click on my monitor, and I'm going to hit space. So when you hit space, your monitor goes full screen, and you can hit F on your keyboard to frame the render. So if you just hit F, it will just automatically kind of plug itself in and fit. So we're going to wait for this render to come in and see if we notice anything that's wrong, you know, that we want to go back and adjust. It's always good to quality control in this way. So I've kind of skipped forward a little bit in the render, and I can see now that there is some kind of mesh pattern on her cheek and around her eyes. And I think this is because I haven't subdivided her geometry, because you can see it on the ear as well. So this is why this is important to kind of do high scale render checks. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and amend that. So by hitting space, you can then return to our recipe. We're going to go to the Arnold Object Setting node, and we're going to do the same thing that we did for the chrome balls and the grey ball, but we're just going to do it for all of her geometry. So we're going to just drag that into the cell of our Arnold Object Setting. So everything that we've set in there is going to be affected by that. So now we're going to go and we're going to do a final render and see where we're at. So as we're waiting for this to come in, we can now kind of see just in the initial few little buckets that are being rendered there that we no longer have the mesh coming through on the render, so that's good. We've solved that issue. And we can also kind of zoom in and have a look whilst it's rendering at certain parts. I really quite like the little like freckles that we put in Mari. I think they're coming across really well, and I'm quite happy with the overall feel of her skin texture here. Obviously, the rest of the model you could work on way more than what we've done here. You know, I'm just standing things in so we can get an impression of the final result. But I think it's looking pretty cool regarding the actual skin shader. So I suppose this has been a lesson in kind of a very simple approach, but a very effective one, you know? So inside of Mari, we were using some very simple kind of details, like the freckles and the gradation on the nose and the ears and the cheek and the forehead, to kind of pump a bit of life into her texture. And then, you know, just kind of really delicately balancing some parameters inside of the Arnold standard subsurface section, and kind of getting the result that we want. So finally, I hope you found this tutorial of use. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.